Welcome to the Dryden Theater. I am Bruce Barnes, the Ron and Donna Fielding Director of the George Eastman Museum, and we are very pleased that you have joined us for this evening's program, In Conversation, Judy Glickman Lauder and Dr. Judith Goldstein, organized in connection with the exhibition Resistance and Rescue, Denmark and the Holocaust, which is being presented in our Gallery Obscura community gallery through Sunday, October the 1st. I encourage you to visit the exhibition after our conversation here this evening. Judy Glickman Lauder is a lifetime photographer, or a lifelong photographer, and a humanitarian and philanthropist. Her books include Upon Reflection, photographs by Judith Ellis Glickman, a book on the work of her father, the photographs of Irving Bennett Ellis, and most recently, Presence, the photography collection of Judy Glickman Lauder. Her book, Beyond the Shadows, The Holocaust and the Danish Exception, is available at the museum store, and she will be there after the conversation to sign copies of the book. Her photographs are in private collections and public institutions around the world. 2 traveling exhibitions of her work, Holocaust, The Presence of the Past, and Resistance and Rescue, Denmark's Response to the Holocaust, have been shown in more than 200 cultural, educational, and civic institutions worldwide. And we're very, very pleased to have formulated with Judy's help a special presentation of that body of work here. So thank you very much, Judy, for that. Dr. Judith Goldstein is an author, historian, and human rights leader. Her scholarly work has focused primarily on diversity, immigration, and post-war history concerning Europe and the United States. In 1997, she founded Humanity in Action, an international educational organization which has engaged over 2,750 college and university students in its programs. She served as its executive director until March 2023, which, if you're counting, is 26 years. And she's now the director emeritus, executive director emeritus of the institution. She's the author of the books, The Politics of Ethnic Pressure, American Jewish Committee Fight Against Immigration Restriction from 1906 to 1917, Crossing the Lines, Histories of Jews and Gentiles in 3 Communities, about 3 communities in Maine, and Inventing Great Neck, Jewish Identity and American Dreams, which I think is an absolutely fantastic title, by the way, Judy. She received her doctorate from Columbia University. Before we begin our conversation, it is my pleasure to present a video message from Ambassador Beat Besse, the Consul General of Denmark in New York.
Good evening to everyone gathered at the Eastman Museum tonight. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but I'm happy for this opportunity for a video greeting. You're about to witness a conversation between 2 incredible women. They're both long-term friends of Denmark and of the Consulate General in New York. Distinguished photographer Judy Glickman Lauder and Humanity in Action founder Dr. Judith Goldstein. Both these women, each in their own way, have delivered invaluable contributions to the retelling of the story of the flight and rescue of the Danish Jews in October of 1943. Their impressive work is commendable, and I would like to say thank you for that. The events of October 1943 is a dark chapter in humanity. However, today, 80 years later, the story still remains a beacon of light that also inspires us to think about universal dilemmas. It underscores the importance of strong civic institutions, of cultivating individual courage. It makes us think about our own responsibility to protect civilians during times of war and conflict. And sadly, this story is as relevant as ever. The 80th official commemoration takes place in Denmark in mid-October. Also, it will be marked around the world in programs throughout the year. In New York City, we look forward to the opening next month of an exhibition Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It will have a special focus on children and young adults and their families. I hope that many of you will have the opportunity to come and also see this exhibition. Let me end by wishing you all a good evening of reflection and good conversation. Enjoy your evening and good night.
Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being here. So I'd like to start, Judy, with asking you about your beginnings with photography, or your history with photography, sort of from early on. If as a little bit of background and context for your work that we're talking about here today.
Thank you, Bruce, and really, thank you. We arrived here yesterday, and we are blown away by this incredible Eastman Museum and feel so honored to be here. So thank you. I think that there are not a lot of people who have been involved almost every day in photography for over 80 years. But that's me. As a child, my father was a physician, but he was a passionate photographer, and I kind of grew up in front of his camera and also in his dark room, and also in Northern California, meeting some of his friends, such as Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, and so on. It was kind of a mecca for photography early on. So I've been doing this a while. Should I say more?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I've been doing a lot of photography, but the soul of my work was in the late 80s when I started going to the camps and started photographing Holocaust-related subject matter. And I spent 3 years going to many, many camps, ghettos, the trains, the memorials, Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, and so on. And some of that work has been shown. I mean, quite a bit of it has been shown. And this lovely lady saw some of my work and asked me to go to Denmark to try to put together an exhibit. And that's why we're here.
Great. No, you get to keep that.
Right, you keep okay.
I am going to just, although we're only showing one image from your series on the Holocaust and the concentration camps and the death camps and other sites related to the Holocaust. We just have one image that we're showing in connection with the current exhibition we're doing. If you would talk just briefly, because we have a lot of people in Rochester who are very interested in photography and photographic technique, about some of the distinctive techniques you used, and then we'll move on and talk about the principal topic, if I could impose upon you.
I have always carried 2 cameras, film, black and white, Kodak, Tri-X, and at that time Kodak made high-speed black and white infrared film. So I shot both because with infrared film, you're not really sure what you're getting. It's a lot of accident. You can't really see. You use a red filter. It's out of focus when you're photographing. And it's when you get something, though, it's almost like an epiphany. It's really kind of interesting. And for the Holocaust work and some of the Danish work, it makes it very timeless. The lighting and so on, and some of the graininess. So that's basically.
Yeah, it has an ethereal quality and a haunting quality, which in some ways sort of stepping away a little bit from the very, very dark reality that you're showing is, I think, helps bring a different perspective to the subject matter. And the technique, the result in the photographs that are created somehow fits very well with the subject.
Is that an infrared photograph?
Yes.
That
Yeah.
is infrared.
Yeah.
Okay. There we have the exterior of Auschwitz, and anything that is alive and sun is hitting it, like the weeds that have grown, will go, whoops, that's
It's
not
moved
there.
on, yeah. It's not going to
But
stay
the
on the screen.
portraits, all the portraits are straight, black and white. The infrared, it does become almost ghostly sometimes, and that's the way I felt. I felt as though I was almost, even though I grew up in Northern California, all my family is from the Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. And I was fortunate enough that my parents, my father was born in the States. My mother was born in Poland and didn't get to the States until 1914, and which was pretty late. The whole family could have been caught in World War I, and then again in World War II. So I feel very, very blessed that I am here, and but it was a very emotional experience being there, and also in Denmark when people were hidden in the forests. They didn't know whether they were safe. It was a refuge until they could get onto a boat, or if the Gestapo was going to be coming, marching right through, and they would be caught. And so infrared kind of captures some of that.
So you were just saying that then Judy, I guess, had seen some of the work that you did
Yeah.
and reached out to you. So
Thank goodness.
For both of us.
is it not on?
I don't know. It's okay. Good.
Okay.
Yeah. I was enormously lucky because the director of the Bowdoin Museum of Art learned about Judy's work, decided to put on the exhibition of the Holocaust imagery, and then called and said, "You really have to come to see it." And it was striking, and one shouldn't say beautiful, but moving, and so well done. And the thing that was, I don't know where the idea came from, but somehow I thought, why not ask Judy to do something somewhat different, which would be to go to Denmark and to, in a sense, recreate the narrative of the escape of the Danish Jewish population, and to identify the places and many of the people who participated in the rescue. And this was in the early 90s, and a good number were still alive, and it was really sort of fresh in their minds. The Danes are quite modest about the rescue. They will tell you, well, we just didn't do anything that was unusual or different, which is absolutely not true. They did something very different from other countries. But we were very lucky that so many were still alive, many were still vibrant, and were at an age where they were willing to accept a certain amount of attention for what they had done. So one of the people, not this one, this is Leo Goldberg, but there's a picture that was shown before of a man sitting at a desk whose name is Herbert Pundig. And
They'll come back around.
we'll come back. He'll come oh, so this is on it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, slide. Anyway, but Pundig was an extraordinary figure. There are some great figures in Denmark in the Jewish world after the Second World War. They were grateful to Denmark for having protected them and the community, and they became even more integrated into Danish life. And Pundig became the editor-in-chief of the largest newspaper in Denmark, and knew the story well. He was a survivor himself. He had gone to Sweden. And so he essentially orchestrated your trip. And he said, this is where you go, and this is what you should look at, and these are the people you should talk to. And because he was Pundig, the great man, they spoke to you and sat for you and engaged with you. And you captured then their humanity and their modesty, and to some extent it gave them the opportunity to recollect about what this meant, which was extremely important and significant.
And go ahead, please.
I'm very, very grateful because after photographing the presence of evil and everything, to walk into the country of Denmark and to be able to locate, interview, and photograph these rescuers, survivors, and people in the resistance was just a privilege and a joy for me. It put a smile on my face, and I'm very grateful to this lovely lady right at my right. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Well, it must have been a tremendous antidote to what were some years spent with very, very heavy subject, and being able to engage with people who you admired and who you were exhilarated by the fact that they were still with us.
Just unbelievably so.
And could you tell us at all about your interactions with them?
Oh my goodness, so many. I saw Ollie Sector, and there's Seuss Pandik. Ollie Secker was a medical student at the time in Copenhagen, in the hospital, the Bispebjerg Hospital. It became a center of rescue. They were able to get elderly Jews into the hospital with false names, false illnesses. When there were no beds, they were in the nurses' quarters, they were in the bowels of the hospital, and they even provided a fake funeral to get a procession out of the hospital to part of the coast in Denmark, which was near to Sweden, over the Ore Sound, at night or daytime or whatever, and get them there to wait for a boat that would be available. And then he became a very famous doctor. Everyone had a story. I'm hoping that you might get this book because it just tells every story, and it's memorable, it's interesting, it's history, and it shows that man can make a difference. And this is what we need to think about, not only for ourselves, but for our children, our grandchildren, and so on. That Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany, Gestapo everywhere, I have a photograph of I don't think it's in this exhibit, but it's of a memorial outside, I think it's in Hellerup. People in the resistance in Denmark, where 192 of them had been executed by the Nazis, and so on, that with all this fear and everything that was going on, they rose as a country from the king, King Christian X, to cab drivers and students and just everyone, and the fishermen.
So I first saw the book. Judy and I happened to meet by accident at an Aperture benefit about 5 years ago or so, and exchanged letters. And I sent her some books that the Eastman Museum had published, and she was kind enough to send me 2 books. One, this book, and another, a book of photographs by her father. And I was just enormously moved, really moved to tears by the stories and by the photographs, by the portraits in the book, and had somewhere in the back of my mind at some point something that we really needed to show here. And there really wasn't a gallery that was an appropriate gallery for it until we opened what we call the Gallery Obscura, which is our new community gallery, which is focused really on connecting with the community, and it sort of allows smaller exhibitions and sort of a different timetable. We don't program in it nearly as far in advance. And this was perfect because as I was speaking with Howard Cohen, who's the chair of the JCC board, about what we might exhibit in the space in collaboration with the Jewish Film Festival, essentially. We were talking about a variety of things, and then it occurred to me that this was the perfect opportunity, finally, after 5 years, to be able to show the work. So it came together very, very quickly. But really our institutional, what we find so compelling about it is that it's such a dramatic example of moral courage in a time when we need more moral courage. I mean, we always need more courage, but I think particularly now in the United States and with some of the trends that are occurring in terms of hate crimes, and both on racial basis as well as anti-Semitic acts of hate that are on the rise. This was something where people hear about those stories all the time, but it was an opportunity to tell a positive story about how people made a difference and saved lives by putting their own lives and their families and their well-being at risk. So thank you for the work that you did quite a while ago and giving us the opportunity to bring it here.
Thank
you. So how do you think about the work now? And or how did you think about the work then when you made it, and how do you think about the work now in today's world?
Well, as I said, I just feel it's the soul of my work. It's sadly that it is so relevant today. I never expected that to be. Every audience that I'm in front of or showing or whatever, it's making me feel good because there's a real story and there's a real moral kind of a message that is so pertinent for our time. And so I feel very, very good about that.
And I should mention that one of the things I always say to people about the exhibition, which if you haven't seen, you should see right when we're done, and if you've seen, you should go see again. But is that the importance of the stories that accompany the portraits. And I will mention, as Judy indicated, we had to make a selection of just a relatively small number of the total number of portraits and stories that are in the book, and that there's a lot of additional rich stories that and beautiful photographs, as well as haunting photographs, the Holocaust photographs, that are in the book. So I hope that you'll take advantage of the opportunity to get a copy. But it's we just sort of were, because of the size of the space, forced to make some choices.
It's done so beautifully. I'm just thrilled with the exhibit, thrilled. And there was one more story, because there's two people I think are in this circle. One is Tove Wanborg, and the other is Tor Larsen. He was a policeman in northern part of Denmark, Elsinore, part of a secret underground kind of a thing called the Elsinore Sewing Club. And he was getting a family to a boat in the middle of the night. Gestapo saw him, shot him, leg, and so on, bleeding profusely. He couldn't go to a hospital. He would have been arrested, and so on. And Tove Wanborg was a nurse. And somehow they connected, and you probably know the story, and she saved his life. And I was able to photograph them together and apart, and the relationship between the two of them. It's just, there's just amazing stories.
And Judy, if you could talk about, you write in the book about why Denmark was different. Or, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how it was different, but some of the reasons why that was the case. Maybe you could talk about your thoughts about that.
Well, the why is really complicated. Denmark is not a country of saints. It's a country of very good people who participated or responded to a culture that was rather demanding of them. And that culture, I think, should be increasingly recognized as a very liberal Christian culture. The role of the Lutheran Church in this story is quite amazing. And in fact, there's a documentary that's just been made about the church and about the bishop of Copenhagen, who essentially led the anti-fascist campaign. And on the day of the rescue, so let me just go back a little in the history, because it's the rescue is the culmination of Danish protection of the Jewish community was when the Danes welcomed the Jews back to Denmark after the war. In most other countries, despite the war, despite the devastation, the Jews were simply not wanted. In Denmark, they were welcomed back. Their property was protected. In many instances, their taxes were paid for. That is, the country took responsibility for the Jewish population that was under threat. But in any case, from the beginning of the occupation, and we've had discussions about this, Denmark did not make it hard for the Germans to occupy the country. The Danes simply knew that they couldn't. It's a flat country. There was no border. They knew they couldn't do much, and they were prepared for defeat. But they set certain circumstances as they negotiated with the Germans, and they negotiated. And this was not true for many other occupied countries. They negotiated, and they negotiated on behalf of the Jews. And from the beginning of the occupation, they made clear that the Jewish community was simply not to be touched. They were to continue as normal citizens under German occupation. This was backed by the government, which essentially stayed in power, despite the fact that the Germans occupied the country, despite the fact, and we've talked about this, that essentially Denmark was recognized as a collaborating country. It did not resist. It did not have a resistance movement that moved to another country, as did the Norwegians, for example, and the French. There were no governments in exile. But the Danish government essentially worked with the Germans. 3 years into the war, with Stalingrad, and the sense that the Germans were not going to win, the resistance movement gets stronger and stronger. The Swedes begin to depart from their pro-German position, and it becomes clear that the resistance movement in Denmark needs to get stronger, more potent, and cooperate even more with the British. The Germans don't like this. And finally, they look around and decide, what is this? A Jewish population in a country under German protection is not Judenrein. I mean, it's still functioning. And they decide to deport all the Jews. It's a complicated story about how this news gets out. The Jews were not prepared for this, but the Danes were. And the Danes, when they know that the Jews are going to be vulnerable, and the Jews have no preparation at all, the Danes then, through the resistance movement, begin to embrace and to protect and to provide the various means of escape for the Jews. And Sweden says, we will take them. And then you begin on Rosh Hashanah, essentially, 80 years ago, you begin this extraordinary resistance countrywide. To go back to the Lutheran Church, the bishop sends out a notice to every Lutheran church in the country. And the statement is read that there is a higher God. Within the government, there's a higher God than the Germans, there's a higher God than the fascist belief. And the job of Christians is to serve the higher God, which means to protect the vulnerable. And they do it. So it is a spontaneous movement. It comes at a time when the Danes are sick of collaborating or of going along with the Germans. They really want now to engage in defiance. And it's a serious matter, because if you are caught protecting a Jew, you would be shot. But they do this, and they are able to protect and enable 97% of the Jewish population to escape, to go to Sweden. The Swedes will keep them and protect them for 2 years. But one other thing is extraordinary. They negotiate with the Germans so that the Jews who are caught, 450 of them, will be sent to Theresienstadt, but not to Auschwitz. This is a deal that was made. And the second part of this was that the Danes would be able to send to the Jews in Theresienstadt packages of food and clothing and vitamins so that they could survive. No other country that was occupied took responsibility for Jews who were deported to the east and essentially annihilated. It was extraordinary. And then a few months before the end of the war, the Danish and Swedish Red Cross negotiated to liberate the Jews in Theresienstadt early, to take them in white buses during the war to Sweden so that they would survive. And then when the war is over, they are welcomed back in Denmark. It is trauma. It is the only Jewish community that survives in full. It doesn't want to draw attention to itself. Jews throughout the world, are in total awe of Denmark for what it did to protect this community. The Jews in Denmark have a complicated relationship and a certain degree of guilt also for those who were imprisoned and sent to Theresienstadt. 50 of them died before the care packages began to arrive. So the survival rate is the highest, and the resistance is incredibly strong. But most of all, there was the enactment of responsibility in which Jews were considered citizens and valuable and to be protected, and therefore the symbol of resisting the Germans as opposed to those who should be destroyed, to go along with the Germans. It's an extraordinary story, which we still don't quite understand. We're coming to the 80th. There are going to be a number of events in Copenhagen and throughout the world dealing with this, asking the question, what makes a culture resistant? What makes it act in a decent manner in which it does not turn on one of their own? So that question is the question that really is relevant for us today, because we have many of the tensions that were very much alive during those years. But the church, the Lutheran church, the sense that there was principle, there was responsibility, there was somehow the sense that the moral human being had to act. Extraordinary. The church.
Thank you. Judy, is something you'd like to say? And then I'm going to ask if people have some few questions.
Do I want to what?
Would you like to say anything else? Because I'm going to ask if people have any questions.
Love to have some questions. But thank you, Judy, because that's a really important part of the story.
And the one thing actually I'll say is what I find remarkable is how quickly everything happened. So my understanding is that the news really went to the Danes within 72 hours of the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, and that maybe 48 hours, but certainly within 72 hours, and that they got the message. In addition to getting the message to the Lutheran churches, that they got it to the chief rabbi in Copenhagen, and who then got the message to people in his congregation about, and in very subtle ways, because you couldn't say it, but
Go
basically,
home.
don't go home, go anywhere but go home. And don't go to a friend's house, don't go to a Jewish friend's house, go somewhere else. And but that in that very short period of time, because the Germans were going to start rounding up the Jews at the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, and so that the whole thing turned in a couple days, essentially, and the ability to act that quickly and to react that quickly was quite remarkable.
The resistance movement was prime for this. They were ready. They were already engaged. The country psychologically was ready to throw off the Germans and to defy them. The Jews were completely at a loss. They just did not know where to go, what to do, and they needed the Danes, the non-Jewish Danes, to provide the leads, to provide the protection, to provide the homes. And when you read in Judy's book, Rabbi Melchier's description of going with a family of 4 people to a priest's home whom he had only met once. And the priest said, come stay with me. And then he had to go to another family. a home of a priest, and the priest had 60 people staying in his house. The church was ready. It was open to help. Now, there was one great betrayal, which in fact took place in a church, which is a terrible story, and Judy has photographed the church. But it was very, very rare that this happened. As opposed to a country like the Netherlands, which had a much larger Jewish population and a much more severe occupation, but the rate of betrayal of Jews by Dutch in order to get a few, not dollars, but to get a little bit of money because you were paid if you betrayed. The betrayal rate is astonishingly high. That simply did not happen in Denmark.
Thanks. Thank you. So, questions?
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Dr. Goldstein. When you were talking about they negotiated to be able to send care packages, A, are you surprised that the Germans would be open to that? And B, that they actually arrived and that the Germans didn't interfere?
Well, who else, what other country tried to negotiate? Nobody did. The Danes did. And did they have power? No. The Germans didn't want more trouble from the Danes. It was 43. There was the sense that things were turning. But essentially nobody asked. Nobody said, this is what we must do. We're going to take responsibility for them. It's hard to explain, but they did it, and they insisted on it, and it certainly was absolutely critical. The Jews in Theresienstadt were recognized as being special, and in fact, there are stories about Jews in Theresienstadt, non-Danes, who would give letters or possessions to the Danish Jews to hold on to, because it was understood that the Danish Jews would survive. They were special. And in fact, there was an inspection of Theresienstadt in which the Germans transformed the whole thing into a mock, model city, because the Danish and the Swedish Red Cross were coming to see it. They went along with the charade, but the Danish Jews had the advantage of being protected. Why they did it, we don't know. It's hard to know. But nobody else tried.
And Theresienstadt was essentially a ghetto that had been created for the specific purpose of it was sort of a larger concentration camp where it could look as if it were something that it wasn't in some sense. But there was terrible typhoid there. The death rates were just horrendous.
Horrible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did I get that about right?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was nothing good about it, that's for certain. Except, the Danes were not sent to Theresienstadt, to Auschwitz or to the extermination camps, even though Theresienstadt was a deadly place to be. It was horrible. It was massively overcrowded. It was, they were underfed. There were diseases throughout. And the day after the inspection, the massive deportations continued. From Theresienstadt was a holding place before going to the extermination camps.
Other questions?
Hi. Not so much a question, but just some comments. So my great-grandmother was a Danish resistor, a part of the Danish underground. And when I did my research in Galilei, which is right there, what I found remarkable, first of all, it took 3 weeks. They hid those people in 3 weeks' time and got them out. If you look at a map of Denmark, it is all along the coast which means everybody was involved. The farmers, the mailmen, the taxi drivers, the college kids. My friend is Danish, and she asked her father, who was there at the time, like, why, Dad? Like, why did you guys do this? And his answer was, because it's the humane thing to do. You know, they're Danish people, including the refugees who escaped to Denmark during the war, you know, before 43. They also took them as well. They weren't originally from Denmark, but to them, they were the Danish people. And I just find it remarkable that only 6% of all the Jewish children survived the Holocaust, yet Denmark saved 95, 96, 97%. It's an incredible story that I wish was more in our schools. It's really not, except for Number the Stars, of course. But I wish it would carry on into the high school years as well.
Other questions? Yes.
Could you please say something about how the sessions were set up, how you've identified the people, how you interviewed them, how those interviews were recorded and coordinated with the photographing?
As Judy mentioned, there was one key person, the head of the Politiken, which is like the New York Times or whatever, who was a survivor, and he really knew survivors, rescuers, and where they were hidden, and so on. So I was given addresses and names and places to go, and kind of tracked people down. Almost everybody spoke English, except for the fishermen. And when I went to Galilee, where I think 12,000 Danes were rescued from that one village, I think, something like that. No, that's too many.
Too many.
That's way too many. Okay, anyway, 1,200. Okay. I brought a translator, and I was on fishing boats and so on, and able to communicate and so on, took trains, got people's stories, went to where they were, and it just worked. And I had 3 trips, and there were many, many more that I, did not photograph. It was really quite an amazing experience. Did I answer your question?
Well, I'm interested in the process. And did you have a tape recorder?
I didn't have a tape recorder. I think I took some kind of notes, and I think Judy fleshed it all out, or you interviewed later, or what?
Well, I think what happened was Judy came back. I know Judy came back, and she came back with films, and she came back with photographs, and Melanie, who works so marvelously with Judy, printed them. And Judy then was able to identify who these people were. Then we through Herbert Pundig, who was the man who made all these introductions, we were able to go back to these people and ask them for statements. That is, Judy didn't record and didn't really make notes about who they were, but the combination of the film and her memory and engagement with them, and then Pundig's knowledge about all of them, we were able to put the story together. So it starts really with the photograph, then deciding which ones would make the narrative. What you don't see in this small exhibit is you don't see the beginning. You don't see, though on the cover of this newsletter you see a picture of the chief rabbi in the synagogue. So the story begins photographically in this narrative in the synagogue, And then you have then there's this a time of great vulnerability, and you, for example, saw a picture of a crypt. That's a Danish church where the Torahs were kept during the war. This was quite extraordinary. Then there's in the exhibition and in the book a picture of the hospital where the Jews were essentially presented as dead, and then many places of escape. So we put this together as a narrative, and you get closer and closer to the coast, and then to the water, and then whatever. But it was pieced together, and but it was only possible because of the base of these beautiful photographs. That's the essence of the whole thing. The rest was added on. But we were very lucky that Pundig did so much for us. The Danes are very complicated. They are proud. They are self-effacing. They like the recognition, but not too much. You don't cross the line, and they say, we only did what anybody should do. But they knew they did something very, very special. And 50 years after, and this is really quite interesting, the trauma of engaging in the escape, the trauma of being in the resistance, the trauma of having Germans after them, that came out much, much later. 50 years later, many had breakdowns. They couldn't sleep. That is, the pressure of defying the Germans and of being caught was so great. But they absorbed it. That is, Denmark was not a post-traumatic society after the war. But individuals suffered from the traumas many, many years later. It was a country that sort of put it in abeyance and a kind of denial. Oh, this is what Danes do. We take care of each other.
You mentioned a new documentary.
What's that?
You mentioned a new documentary.
The new documentary on the Lutheran Church. Yeah.
What's the name of it?
It's in Danish. But I'll give
That
you,
doesn't
I'll
stop
give you
us
the
from
link.
showing it.
No, I'll tell you what, we'll put it, we have a website which has the story and whatever, and we'll put that, I think it's already on the website, but if you give me your information, I'll get it to you. It's now available. It's going to be shown for the first time widely in Denmark in October. There are a number of events for the 80th, and one of them is an international conference, and this film will be shown. The Danes are no longer church-going people. It's very rare that a church even holds services. I mean, it's become a deeply secular society. And so, for some reason, this recognition of the church has been very slow to come. But it is an extraordinary story. And the bishop of Copenhagen actually went to Germany in 1939 and preached against the fascists in a German church. Extraordinary. It was a cohesive culture. It was a culture of responsibility.
Just ask, the picture you took of the rescuer on the boat, was that the actual boat they used to get them to Sweden, or were all those boats kind of gone?
No, they weren't all gone. There were boats. No, there were some boats. In fact, there's a boat in the Jewish Heritage Museum. There's a new boat getting a boat is a big thing in American Holocaust museums. So there's a new boat in Florida.
It's in Mystic, Connecticut right now in New York.
That's the one for the museum. Yeah.
I don't have the exact quote, but the bishop said said that this was a time that we need to, oh, whoops. That this is a time that we need to, exactly what Judy was saying, we need to worship God instead of man, and which was really quite a major statement, being occupied. It was really a very strong resistant statement, and it went to every single church, and it's quite amazing. There's a lot of question marks. Denmark, as far as I know, did not have the anti-Semitism for centuries that so many other countries had. And there was one person, Grundtvig, that talked about, he was a pastor, he was a teacher, he was everything, and he started a whole high school and talked about as though there was no such thing as the other, that we are all people. And it was pretty powerful. And I think the Danes have always been very independent. They're a small country. And it just coalesced. And, I wish that we had the exact answers and so on. But it's also a small story. In Poland, 3 million Jews gone. The population's so huge. So in scope, it's small, but in the meaning and the importance of it, it's huge. It's really huge. And it's just something that, we kind of want the whole world to recognize and to take hold. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was wondering about today, whether there's xenophobia against, fear of the other that's characteristic of so many European countries now, whether this is also present in Denmark, or if this tradition you highlight in 1943 persists to this day.
They wouldn't do it today. It's a very difficult issue. Denmark is probably the most vigilant country protecting itself from immigrants. And Denmark is a country that has engaged in some very complicated relationships with the Muslim community, which is not large. I think there are 215,000 Muslims in Denmark, and the Danes are not happy about that. It's a cohesive culture. It's a culture that is very confident about its identification, and it doesn't. It is not capable now of expanding to include these general concepts of, refugees have a right to come, and asylum seekers are to be welcomed. It also is a country that is on the edge of banning circumcision, which is mainly directed to the Muslim community, but definitely will affect the Jewish community. So there are many, many issues. There was a tradition of some tradition of anti-Semitism, but essentially the Lutheran Church in Denmark was a liberal Lutheran church, as opposed to the German Lutheran Church. It was really liberal. And the second thing is that Denmark nearly ceased to exist. In 1864, it nearly disappeared off the map. And so when it comes back together, the question is, how are they going to keep the society Danish? What are they going to do? And they begin to develop a sense of taking responsibility for each other. They develop a welfare state which is fairly deep after the First World War. And so they extend this great big umbrella, shall we say, of welfare to everybody except the communists. But the Jews get to live under the umbrella, unlike other countries. The racism was just not part of the Danish ideology. And they weren't going to give in to the Germans, except to let them run the country, but up to a point. Answers we don't have. Exactly. The king did not wear the Star of David. That we have to tell you all. He would have.
Yeah.
You tell the story.
Well, when people think of Denmark, they think, oh, that's where the king wore the Star of David. He did not, because part of the negotiation was the Jews were not separated until 43, and so there was no need. But then there's a wonderful book that came out about 4 years ago called Countrymen by Bo Lidegaard. And he talks about an interview with King Christian X, and who this was, and his foreign minister or something, somebody Buell. They're having this conversation, and his minister of defense or foreign minister or something is asking him, but King, should this happen, what shall we do? And the king answered, yes, we will all wear the star. So even though there was a myth that grew up and then it was, ooh, it's a myth, it really was not a myth. It's kind of quite amazing. And the king rode his horse through the streets during the occupation and so on. So, and he also, it was the first time I think royalty came into a synagogue, right? Was that, because wasn't there a letter on Bent Melchior's wall from?
In 39, the fascists, of course, were in control in Germany, and Denmark was very careful about not offending the Germans. The Jewish community was dedicating or rededicating the synagogue and invited the king to come. And then they communicated with the king and said, but if this would be something that would create tensions with the Germans, then we'll withdraw the invitation. And the king wrote back and made it clear that he was coming, and that if he were not invited, he would be insulted. So right from the beginning of right before the war, the king and the government made it clear that the Jews were to be protected.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Again, I encourage you to come see the exhibition in our project gallery, in our Gallery Obscura, and which is the first gallery that you will get to if you go to the left from the Thomas Tischer Visitor Center. And as I mentioned, we'll also have Judy Glickman Lauder signing books in our bookshop. Thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
And to all of our Jewish guests, Shana Tova.